So, Santacruz Batman here. So as I last left it in part 9 of the origins of Santacruz Batman, so this is chapter 10, part 10. I was traveling up to Northern California, especially on the Redwood Highway, into the Emerald Triangle, which is where most of the good marijuana is grown traditionally. And the federal government was slapping $10,000 a day fines on all illegal growers. And there was a humanitarian crisis. The people out in the woods actually doing the work were stranded, penniless, running out of food. Weather's turning bad. It's already getting rainy and bad up in Northern California in January. And no one was doing anything about it. So kind of mentioned that I was, traveling up in that area for a good 2 years with mountain bikes on the top of my Ford Fiesta and enjoying the Redwood Highway, and had made quite a few connections and friends, and had been pretty much accepted by the community as a known visitor and a proponent for kind of the lifestyle and the communities that they had built over more than 3 decades. So I got home shortly after that trip where I'd been mistaken as a federal agent because I was in a car, a Chrysler 300, with a bunch of electronics that I'd added since I'm a high-tech person. But they figured it out rather quickly that I wasn't a federal agent. So I think I turned around within about a week or so. I put a bunch of coolers in my car with beer, milk, apples, bananas. I was carrying a significant amount of cannabis and cigarettes, and actually a big stack of cash. I took out a couple $1,000s in order to pay for my expenses, but also in order to float a $20 bill to some of the more desperate people who had no resources, no money. And I think there was probably upwards of 20,000 people that were affected by that. I could be off, but if you kind of do the math on the number of people it takes in order to support cannabis growing operations for the market demand, that's kind of the numbers you're looking at. So driving up and down the Redwood Highway, I would easily spot people who were not really hitchhiking, they were walking to get to water, to get to food, to get to help, because they'd been abandoned. Now, when you pull up on someone in the middle of that area in a car that looks like an FBI car, you're not going to get a lot of positive reception. So at the time, I'd been learning to surf in Santa Cruz, and I had an 11-foot longboard, a racing longboard that you could also surf on. And I'd been enjoying my time in Bolinas in Marin County, if you're not familiar with it. The oldest continuing running saloon in California is called Smiley's, and it's in a little town called Bolinas, which is kind of a secret surfing community. So I hope I don't blow the secret there. But not many people are watching my videos anyways. Needless to say, that community, even though it's literally less than an hour north of San Francisco, where some of the richest people and the most expensive real estate on the planet are, that's a really good community. And so I won't say anything more about it because I don't want to spoil the secret. But Bolinas, California, in Marin County, and especially Smiley's, which is a really old saloon that has live music, and that's a special community. And that's kind of where I decided, all right, I'm going to strap this board on top of this Chrysler 300, a fairly new car at the time, and I had a big Batman sticker on the surfboard on top of the roof, and an 11-foot stand-up board is a large board, and a Chrysler 300 is not typically the kind of vehicle you see that on. Normally you see it on some sort of Pathfinder or a SUV of some sort. So that kind of was a symbol, and I also had a large Batman stickers on the back of the car. And so my moniker in Santa Cruz was the Santacruz Batman, because the homeless there knew me as the Santacruz Batman. And I thought, well, let's just introduce ourselves as that. So you can imagine pulling over in that car, someone walking up going, is this a government official? What is this? And getting in, and I've got food for you. I've got a beer for you. Maybe I've got a pre-roll for you. Maybe even cigarettes. And so they're essentially hitchhiking, and I'm picking them up. And within about 20, 30 minutes of anywhere up there, you might run into a small town that has a gas station or some sort of food. And I give them $20 cash. And that kept them alive for at least a couple days. But I introduced myself as the Santacruz Batman. And after, I think, 2 weeks of doing that, there were a couple people I picked up. And that community, your reputation and your integrity is everything. And your street name and your reputation kind of follow you real quickly. And so there were actually people who, before they got in the car, they said, I've heard of you, the Santacruz Batman. And they would get in. Now, if you've ever had any propensity to pick up hitchhikers and talk to them, it's a wonderful way to pass the journey. It's not nearly as dangerous as you might think it is. You have to trust in in humanity. Some of those were the most wonderful conversations I've ever had with strangers. And at the end of those, sometimes it took an hour to get them to where they were going, or someplace that was safe with shelter. And that $20 I gave them would buy them food, at least for a few days, maybe a phone call, let alone to my smartphone, in order to contact family. And so word started to spread. So I became the Santacruz Batman, not just in Santa Cruz, but in Northern California and the Emerald Triangle. And the struggles I saw on that journey were very moving. And you kind of saw the whole injustice of the system, because people have been working as laborers, doing what was necessary to satisfy the market for cannabis in California, with, intentions of really just surviving. Those people aren't really making much money at all. And in fact, the whole cannabis business is really not as lucrative as the layman might think. It's a very hard job. It's as hard or harder than growing potatoes or wheat or any other kind of agricultural endeavor. And being on the wrong side of federal law makes it all that much more difficult. So that's really where I became the Santacruz Batman, outside of Santa Cruz. And so the overlap between helping those growers who are stranded out in the middle of nowhere, there's a real overlap between the kind of struggles you see with homeless people, who are actually some of the most wonderful and generous people I've ever run into, which is kind of a contrary to what you would think if you didn't know anything about the situation. But of course, at the end of those travels, especially on the Redwood Highway, I would end up at the northern tip of California, specifically Smith River, which is really one of my favorite areas. And if you're not familiar with Smith River, it's literally about 8 miles south of the Oregon border, and I'm an Oregonian. So every time I go up there, of course I'm gonna jump over the border and see my home state, smell the trees. Brookings, Oregon is a beautiful place. The coast up there is wonderful, and if you have a wetsuit, the surfing's pretty good. And there's a lot of Indian reservations, Native American Indian And I would jump across the border multiple times. And dispensaries at that time in Oregon were kind of like the 2017 California, where you just had a better selection. You had a better ability to look at the quality of the product. It wasn't all packaged. They would bend the rules on the minimum amount you could buy, et cetera, et cetera. And there's just the dispensaries in Oregon were just superior, and I think they still are to this day. Way lower cost, better selection. Arguably, some of the best marijuana grown in the United States comes out of Oregon, especially the western and southwestern part of the state, where you're kind of in the coast range there. So OG Kush, well, there's Oregon OG, ocean grown, original gangster, whatever you want to call it. And that's when I noticed, so the community knew who I was, Santacruz Batman. I was no longer an enemy. And it was wonderful to spend time with those communities up there as a known person and be accepted. But I think the federal government saw it the other way. So from their observations, I was going back and forth across the California border, and I was going up on those trips at least once every 3 months, and then sometimes once every few weeks. And so that seemed to have triggered something. And so now the federal government considered me a potential smuggler, which I wasn't. But if you're not aware of it, the federal government has a lot of leeway, especially on interstates, to control commerce between states. And so whether or not I was a smuggler, which I was not, I was mistaken for one. And the tactics that they can use up there when there's very restricted ways to get between points A and B that are hundreds of miles apart. You have the ocean on one side, you have the coast range of Oregon, and you have essentially the coast range of Northern California, especially between Redding and Eureka, is pretty nasty. And so gasoline is necessary to run your car. And one of the tactics they use when they suspect you're a smuggler is they start cutting off the gasoline to you. How do they do that? I really don't want to get into all the details, but if you pull up into a gas station and you're a target of the federal government for suspected smuggling, they have ways of essentially restricting you to buying gasoline, especially on a credit card or a debit card. So you end up, out of desperation, having to fuel your car with cash. And on some occasions, you actually have to go fill up a gas can as an individual, because they've now tagged your license plate. And anytime you pull up to a gas station, they have ways of restricting you from buying gasoline. If you don't believe this, then go ahead and try it yourself. And that's when, because everyone knew me up there as a Santacruz Batman, they were trying to help me. So they would give me advice about how to get around the federal government's tactics against basically transporting cannabis, which I wasn't, but it doesn't really matter. Sometimes perception is reality, right? And so that's when I got to know, I wouldn't call them criminals, I wouldn't really call them smugglers. They were simply people who were transporting the cash crop and product of Northern California to various parts in California, and I don't know really much more about it. But I knew that I was mistaken as being if not one of them, an advocate and someone who was helping them. And I was a little shocked and dismayed at the federal government's response to what I considered a philanthropic kind of humanitarian effort to help people who had been stranded, who were essentially agricultural workers in what was not really a completely illegal business. It was simply they weren't paying their taxes. they weren't paying the huge fees that it takes in order to become a legal grower up in anywhere that actually legalizes marijuana. And so there I was caught in between the federal government and dichotomy with the local community who understood what I was doing and appreciated it. So I think I'll wrap up chapter 10 there, because we're kind of getting near the end of the origins. So there I am. I'm the Santacruz Batman, known, hopefully loved in Northern California, Santa Cruz, and in other parts that I traveled to. And let's stop chapter 10 there.
She appears composed, so she